Okay, good afternoon. My name is Tracy Miranda. And I'm going to talk to you today about lean design critique or optimizing UX when your design time is limited. So user experience, or UX, is short for user experience. And in my work as a tools consultant, I'm seeing it is becoming increasingly a tool differentiator. So it's becoming really important for all software tools. But in my experience, there are these three myths out there that I hear over and over again that stop developers from doing the right thing. So we'll look at those, and we'll look at what you can do about those with the 7 steps of the lean design critique. And for that, we'll look at a very specific case study to see how it was applied in one of the projects I worked on. Okay, to get started, first of all, I'm going to explain what I mean by UX, and hopefully in a way that you will remember. So I want you to use your imagination, and does anyone know what that is? Guesses? An egg? Yeah, it's a boiled egg. But I want you to imagine that boiled egg is your software product. And it's a tool that everybody wants to use, and it's got lots of users, so it's out there for the world. Then for every good product, you have your user. Now, I hope your users aren't as demanding as my 3-year-old, especially first thing in the morning when she's really hungry and she comes to me and she wants her breakfast. Now, if I give her the breakfast like that, it's just going to be a disaster. I'm going to have the egg thrown on the floor, a big mess, and a huge meltdown. So I definitely don't want that. So to keep my user happy, I'll focus on the user experience. So I'll serve her the egg like this. And to me, that's what user experience is all about. It's everything from the plate to the spoon to the egg cup with her favorite lion on it, to the bread soldiers on the side. And most importantly for her, the fact that I've cut the top off so she can get into it as soon as possible and just get on with eating breakfast. So when we talk about user experience, it is the complete experience. For your tools, it will be the buttons, the way you download it, the way it handles errors. So it's a complete experience your users have, some of which are in your control and some of which might not be in your control. Okay. So, time and time again, when I talk to people about UX, many tool developers appreciate that it starts with them. But I often hear these 3 myths about why they are not really going to do anything about UX. And even though it's so important and it can make the difference between their technology being a real help versus a hindrance, as anyone who's ever had a bad user experience with a website or a mobile phone knows. Oh, and sorry, just quickly, user interface we differentiate, and that's just the way you interact with the egg. In this case, it would just be the spoon. Okay, so the first myth I hear all the time is that UX is a design job, and it's about picking colors and fonts and icons. And most developers go, well, that's somebody else's job. I do the coding, someone else does the art. I don't know, have you heard the joke? It goes, how many UX engineers does it take to change a light bulb? And usually the answer is 0. It's not an engineering job. But if you want a nice light shade, we can help with that. So, well, we'll come back to these myths and see what's the truth in that. Myth number 2. It's all about delighting your users, so it's much more for web and for mobile apps. And a lot of people have the sense that UX is all about Apple product, that complete out-of-the-box experience, the nice shininess of it, and just the way you use it. But a lot of my clients work in industry, so it might be science or embedded, and they'll be, well, our users don't really have a choice, so why should we bother with UX? That's for Apple. For our users, they're stuck with the tool. They have to get on and use it. The third myth is It's expensive and time-consuming, doing usability testing and focus groups. And this one is quite a hard one to argue with, because at the end of the day, you do need the business case to say, we're going to focus some effort on user experience. Okay, I lied. There's a fourth myth I hear from time to time. And this is for people doing tools within Eclipse, and they blame Eclipse, and they just say, look, the IDE is too complicated and cluttered. Even if I make my tool really nice and slick, there's only so much I can do without changing all of Eclipse. So we'll come back to these myths after we've looked at the process and see what truth there is in that. Right. Okay, so it was in response to these myths that I came up with this process called Lean Design Critique. And what it is a 7-step technique to try to get the most worthwhile optimizations in a short space of time. And it's particularly designed for very feature-rich products, so very complicated things where there's a lot of information for the user to deal with. And typically the sweet spot where I'll use it is when I'm called in to do some work on an existing software tool, and they want some new features. So they're not actually redesigning the UI, but they're saying, we want to add X, Y, Z feature. But there's limited resources. But we try to take advantage of the fact that we're rewriting it anyway to improve the usability at the same time using this method. So the case study we're going to look at in particular for a project I did for Diamond LightSource. Now, Diamond is a synchrotron which is in the Oxfordshire countryside. And it's perhaps not as well known as CERN, but they do lots of groundbreaking research here. And they'll look at the structure of anything from flu viruses to chocolate to eyes, all sorts of things come out of there. And to do that, they have a tool called Dawn, and that's the data analysis workbench. And Dawn is actually an Eclipse project these days, so it's a plotting workbench that people can use in their own products. But Dawn, as it's used in Diamond LightSource, provides a way to analyze the results of lots and lots of different experiments. So you've got things there like tomography and crystallography and all sorts of other ographies. So it's very feature-rich, but it can be quite intimidating, especially when you have new users or scientists or students from universities who are coming in and trying to pick it up and use it for the first time. Now, in particular, we're going to look at the function fitting tool, and I'll give you a high-level overview of what it does. I'm not going to go too much into the nitty-gritty. But the idea is that users will collect some data, and they'll plot that data. It might be a line, or it might be a curve. And then they know there's an equation that maps to that data. So the simple one for a line, a line is mx plus c. And they need to find the values for m and for c. So they'll use this tool to work out what the magic numbers they want to get. So what's the number for m, what's the number for c, or if it's a Gaussian curve, what's the value for a, b, and c. And they need those numbers to go on to their next stage to do analysis. So that's what they want to use this tool for. Now, if we look at the tool itself, this is what the tool looks like in real life. So you've got the plotting area on one side, and on the right-hand side, you'd have the table, which is your way of saying, OK, I'm looking for a Gaussian function, and I'm going to try and fit that to get my parameters, my 3 values of parameters that I can take on to the next stage. So what Diamond were looking to do in this case was actually add some functionality. So they wanted to have more hierarchy, so you could chain functions together. And they also wanted to have support for expressions, so the tool would be more powerful. So in reality, changing the usability wasn't really on the table, but it was something that once I got started, we said, hey, look, this has a lot of scope for improvement, so let's see what we can work on doing without necessarily increasing the budget by a vast amount. So we ran it through this Lean Design Critique. And I'll go through each of the 7 steps one by one. And this is something I hope you can apply to any of your tools in the same way. OK, step 1, identify the 90% task. Now, I can't emphasize how important this step is. This is really the key thing you need to do right at the beginning. And in my experience, for every tool, 90% of the users spend 90% of their time just doing the same thing over and over and over again. And that's really the essence of that tool. That's why that tool exists and what it was designed for, why it's out there in the world. But the trick is really understanding, pinpointing that functionality at the right level and not talking at too broad a scale and not getting down to too low a level. So in Diamond's case, what we did is the product manager specified what the intention of the tool was. And then we've verified this with one key user, which in this case was a Beamline scientist, who was able to give us feedback as to what he actually thought the tool was useful for. And there's good research out there that says, in most cases, you don't really need more than 5 users to give you feedback to really get the most bang for your buck in terms of how to make improvements. And I encourage you to check out that link about what the conditions are where you get the most out of 1, 2, 3, and by the time you've got to 5, you're probably not getting any more information. So in this case, they came back and said, okay, the tool is used for function fitting. And while that might seem a bit obvious, the main thing we had to get at was, what is it not used for 90% of the time? And we highlighted that there were some things like importing and exporting fitting data that they would do occasionally, and perhaps changing the accuracy of the algorithm or creating new fitting functions. These were tasks that were done once in a while, but they fell outside this remit of 90% of the time. Okay, step 2, do a cognitive walkthrough. So in this case, you break down that 90% task you've identified step by step, and you perform the task just as a user would. So you really put yourself in their shoes and write it down or use whatever process you have to get to this. So we did that with Diamond, and for that main case, we broke it down into just these 7 steps, which we'll look at in more detail in a minute. Okay, step 3 is analyze clicks, or really anything measurable. Now, once upon a time, I used to work in an embedded company as my first job, and embedded tools are really notorious for having bad user experience. The companies produce hardware. They expect people will choose the tools based on the hardware and not on the tools. So typically, you get the tools from one place, you get a tool chain from another place, and you get the documentation from perhaps a third place, if there's any documentation at all. And you kind of have to pull that all together and get something running and put it on the board. Now, for one project where we switched to using Eclipse IDE, the manager actually turned around and said, oh, actually, I want users to be able to do this in just 3 clicks from the minute they have the IDE open. And we kind of thought that he'd just taken to drinking a lot in the evenings, because at the time it was just completely ridiculous. But we were up for the challenge, and we started to really look at that flow and see how we could optimize it. And using Eclipse, we would do things like put in defaults, or make sure some things were automatically handled, or write some code. And in the end, we did manage to get it down to about 6 steps. But he pushed us really hard and said, no, it just has to be done in 3. 3 is like a magic number, so let's see what we can do with that. And how it did work out in the end is that if you had the IDE open, which is based on Eclipse, you could click New to get the project wizard up. It would pre-populate it with lots of defaults, including a name. So you've done 1 click to say New. Click 2 would be to hit Finish on the wizard, which would then produce your your project with all some software code in and some default hello world. And then 3 would be to do a download and run on the board as 1 button. And so that step would take care of building the product, downloading an image to the board, and then running your software. And even though we just optimized that 1 flow for 1 case and 1 simple hello world, it really impacted on the whole rest of the project and made it all a lot better usability-wise for it. So I guess the point is that it's good to pick a measure that applies to your product. And it could be mouse clicks, it could be mouse travel, it could be number of pages if you're talking about a wizard. But whatever it is, just pick that measure and stick with it. Don't start with something, do some optimizations, and do the marketing thing of saying, oh, look, it's much better in this way. OK, so this is how we did this for Diamond. So we took each of our steps, and we chose to count mouse clicks and mouse travel. So first click, you had to click the auto refit button in the tool. Secondly, we had to select the desired function. And in this case, we realized you had to click on the table first, and then go down to this drop box to change the function you wanted. And you might see it already yourselves, that instantly we're asking the user to find something which is in the middle of the tool. It's not a natural place for your eyes to go to. So one of the things we did as we went along was we weren't afraid to just optimize and draw conclusions as we were looking at it. So already by step 2, we were up to 3 clicks. So step 3 was to set the parameters, which was done in this table down here. Step 4, you would look at the plot just to see if that was giving you what you wanted. Step 5, you might do some tweaking of the parameters. So again, you'd click on that entry and you'd modify the values down here. And step 6, assuming your fit was good, then you would click Update All to say, yes, I would like to take this data to the next stage. And again, there you might see that we're expecting the user to do an update by finding a little button on a toolbar, which might not be obvious to someone who's never used the tool before. And we were able to see by this time we were up to 7 clicks. OK, step 4, analyze screen space usage. So the idea here is that the UE elements should be directly proportional to their importance. So some developers, not all, but some developers do treat all their features like their kids. All of them are equal, and you have to give them equal love, no matter how important they are to the user. But really, you want to consider your UE as all prime real estate. So you need to think carefully about what's going where. So in this case, we were able to identify a couple of boxes which fell outside the 90% task. So people rarely change the accuracy of the fitting routine, and they rarely change the type of fitting. So we thought to ourselves, well, let's move this off from a prominent place and maybe put them in a preference page. Step 5, explore existing designs. So before you jump in and really start optimizing the design, it's a really good idea to not to reinvent the wheel, but to have a look around at what other design paradigms there might be out there that you could reuse and that might fit in with the entire workbench you have or the other tools you have. So in this case, we asked ourselves, well, how is this done in Eclipse? And how is this done in the rest of the tool? And we didn't in this for our case, but sometimes you might ask yourself, how is this done on a mobile phone? So in Eclipse, we found this view. Does anyone recognize? That's the expressions view from the debug perspective. And that provides support for hierarchy. And it also has this panel down there where you could edit expressions and things like that. So that was a paradigm that matched the functionality we were trying to use. So it would be something familiar to the user. So we had to look into, well, could we implement the function fitting tool to match the expression view? OK, step 6 was optimize. So now we were ready to optimize at the same time as we were adding in the new features. So optimizing was really about implementing the new design, writing the code, getting it tested. But one thing we did keep at the forefront was to have this heuristic checklist. So as we were going through, we could check off things. And there's a link to one there, which is really good. So questions to ask yourself is, how's the efficiency of use? Is the system status really visible? And is it quite minimalist, or how's the aesthetic? So just things to keep at the forefront of your mind, even while you're adding in new features. OK, and this is the re-implemented function fitting tool in the same format as the expressions view in Eclipse. So you've got just the one table there instead of the previous two, and you can see that you've got big prominent buttons to capture the main things the user might want to do, and the system status is really up and clear at the top right. Okay, so the final step, you really need to close the loop by rerunning the analysis. And this is where you can really get your measurable difference. So we did that, and in this case, the user had to click the auto refit, set the function they wanted, the Gaussian there, change the parameters, and when they were done, hit update all. And we could count the clicks, and this time we had 4 instead of 7. And we could also put them side by side and get a feel for what was the difference in how much mouse travel users were having to do. And that was a really good thing to do, and it's a good thing to give to managers as well, just to kind of show them that the benefits that you are getting from doing the usability improvements, because they definitely like the numbers. Okay, so that's the lean design critique, and you've got the 7 stages. In this picture, everything's in a nice equal bubble, but one thing I want to emphasize in terms of how long does it actually take. Well, for this project, if we do it by size, I would probably say that's more reflective of the time it takes. It just doesn't take that much time to do the walkthrough and to do the analysis and even the research. A lot of the time ends up just being on the coding and getting things right and the testing. So my point is just, it's really worth doing if you just have it in the forefront of your mind before you're doing any refactoring or adding in new features. It just doesn't cost that much if you do it in this format. Okay, and this seems like a good point to throw in a quote from Steve Jobs, where he says, "Design is not just what it looks like and feels like. Design is how it works." It really is function and form combined. Okay, let's go back to our myths and see if everybody's convinced that these don't really apply. So 2, it's a design job all about best practices, like picking the right icons, fonts, or color palettes. So if you hear that, I'd encourage you to say, no, it's actually a process with rules, guidelines, and measurable outcomes. And it really works for anyone who's technically inclined, which I'm sure you all are, to just take these rules and apply them. And you can get quite far without really having to put in the design and things like that. That can always come at a later step or be done in another way. Step 2, UX is all about delighting your users, so it's more for web and mobile apps. Well, really, UX is all about putting yourself in your user's shoes and really understanding what do your users care about. So if your users want to be delighted, then delight them. But if they just want to get some numbers out in the least amount of time possible, then give that to them and leave out the bells and whistles. Just work out what they want. And step 3, it's expensive and time-consuming doing it, and we don't have focus groups and usability testing. And for that, I'll say, well, just start with the lean design critique, see the improvements you can get out of that, and then maybe you can move on to having some more formal things as you go down the line. And then what about Eclipse? So what about the problem with Eclipse and doing usability in there? Well, I feel that UX in Eclipse is at a real tipping point. With E4, you start to have a lot more control over the windows and the layouts and the perspectives you can have. And it's becoming much more prominently being thought about in the community. Particularly take the CDT community, which are doing embedded development. And Doug Schaefer, who's one of the elders of the CDT community, is doing a lot of work, which he's outlining on his blog about UX matters, that although it's designed for C development, I think will apply to a lot of projects. For example, just having a toolbar where the buttons are a lot bigger and more visible, so a bit more like people are getting used to with having really big icons on the phone. And he's making that available in Eclipse, and so that's something that might spread out to other projects. So it really is a good time in Eclipse to start getting involved in that and making sure you can do the changes and work with Eclipse rather than feeling that you're being held back by Eclipse. Okay, and yeah, my final message is that good UX does start with you, the developers. It is important and it is achievable, and that can be done by you. So I hope you feel kind of empowered to go out and improve your UX and just make the world a more efficient place. Thank you. Right, does anyone have any questions? Yeah, Alex.
Is it something that you could recommend as well for if you are implementing completely new features within story for that feature to say, okay, what's going to be the 90% of this actual feature?
Yeah.
So not looking at the whole product as it is now, but on the feature level as well?
Yeah, no, definitely. It's good. If you're doing something brand new, then I definitely say you want to have your sort of top use cases at the front of your mind, and always keep that in mind as you're designing things, because things often do get lost. So yeah, you don't need to do some of the other steps, but you could definitely use it for a new product as well. Absolutely. Okay, anyone else? Going once? Great, thank you very much.